Meanwhile, I'm introducing Günther Fleck, who is a clinical and health psychologist and head of the Psychology and Educational Science Research Division at the Institute of Human and Social Sciences, National Defense Academy, Vienna, Austria. And he is a lecturer at the Department of Political Science, University of Vienna, and a visiting lecturer here at our university, but not in this faculty. In general, he is teaching also in the Department for History and Philosophy of Science. He is Vice President of the Australian Society for Organismic Systemic Research and Theory, and has several research areas: political, personality and social psychology, psychology of science and knowledge, epistemology and philosophy of science. And maybe I should also add that we know each other for 25 years now. Yesterday evening we calculated, and we can regard each other as very good friends. So I think knowing the lecture and the approach of Günther, now we will have a more balanced situation, something to the left brain. Günther, please.
Dear Kata, thank you very much for this nice introduction. Good morning, dear ladies and gentlemen. Let's try to put the pieces together. What I want to show is that altered states of consciousness, alternate realities and ritual processes are very closely linked, or they can be closely linked. And in the abstract I have written to give an integrative account with respect to general system theory. Only a few words about it. It's not so complicated as it may be the impression. You know the famous sentence by Aristotle, the whole is more than the sum of its parts. This means that the system has emergent traits which cannot be reduced to the parts. If I make an analysis and you put the parts different, you will not find the emergent traits of the complete system. That's the most important thing. So let's start with a nice picture I like very much. It is from Karl Spitzweg, and his pictures are very humorful and with a fine sense of humor. And you see a man sitting here, and it's called the philosopher. This man is deeply involved, maybe in a scientific paper, in a scientific book, and his state of consciousness is an awake state. So he's fully concentrated. And maybe he will get more and more involved into this fantastic literature he's studying. He will enter a kind of a hypnotic state. So if you would go around, he would not recognize that you will be there. And in this self-hypnotic state, suddenly he may have the experience of a total different reality, of an alternate reality. This means he looks to the world, or he understands the world in a total different sense in comparison to the normal wake state. And maybe later on he will fall asleep and he will now be in a total different state of consciousness. So to sum up, if I would ask you, why or how do you know that you are here in this lecture room and that we have Monday and we have November and it's a building of the Eltern and so on? You never question this because you make automatically a kind of a scan, and of course you know. So this is a state-specific awareness which you have, and you are sure that you possess in this moment this state-specific awareness, which is shown here at the center. So you know the phases, the two main phases of states of consciousness, the waking phase and the sleeping phase. And within the waking phase, we can make a differentiation between a lot of different states of consciousness, for example, different trance states, hypnotic states, dissociative states, and so on, or deep relaxation, for example. Then there is a transition phase in the evening when you go to bed. Maybe you will fall asleep very quickly, or you have a phase which is called the hypnagogic phase, the so-called experience of Bildtreffen, what's called. You have images which are running before your eyes as like as a movie or a film. And then you fall asleep, and during the night normally we have the different states, the dreaming states, two different ones, the REM dreaming states and the non-REM dreaming states. It means the rapid eye movements states are very vivid, and you may have experiences which will become very dramatic. That's a lot of things are going on. In the non-REM phase, it is very quiet. Yes, it's even stupid and there is nothing going on. But during the whole night we ever dream. There is no phase where nothing is going on. And sometimes maybe you make the experience, oh, I'm dreaming. And if you have this experience, you will enter a so-called lucid dream. When this happens, when the dreamer knows he or she is dreaming. Has somebody had such an experience of you? Where you really got things that, oh, I am dreaming? And it started now very well, and it's a total different topic, so it's only to mention this very nice example. In the morning when you wake up, sometimes you know, okay, I'm still sleeping or dreaming or I'm awake. There is also a transition phase, which is called the hypnopompic phase, or the hypnopompic state. These states of consciousness may appear spontaneously, may be triggered spontaneously, but they can also be induced by intention. So if you make autogenic training, for example, or if you do some meditative exercises, you enter an altered state by intention. And there is a big field of altered states of consciousness. I want to speak only about these wake phases and intentional states of consciousness. There are, of course, also altered states of consciousness which appear with diseases, psychotic states or delirium states with organic diseases. I will not talk about this. The induction of these different states can be done by psychological means or by psychological stimuli. And there we have two big categories. We have the sensory deprivation dimension and we have the sensory overload dimension. So if you will go into a discotheque with loud music and have lights and lasers and so on, this is a very nice example for sensory overload. If you go to the woods and you will be alone and you will a meditation exercise, it's maybe a nice example for sensory deprivation. But there is also a very different way to induce altered states of consciousness during the waking state if you would use psychotropic drugs. So when I was young, we all made experiences with LSD-25 because at those days it was not forbidden. And I will not miss them, it's very fascinating, but the situation has changed dramatically. And a lot of people always have argued that you can reach very similar states, or even the same states as if you would use, for example, LSD-25. It is an analogous experience, it's similar, but you can believe me, it's not really the same, it's never the same, it's really different. Also the phenomenological phenomena may be very similar. So what is very important now, the so-called consciousness disciplines. So there are a lot of possibilities how you can learn to enter altered states of consciousness. You can learn Eastern meditation techniques. You can learn autogenic training. You can learn different kinds of self-hypnosis and so on. So I will not talk too much about this. I only want to mention these consciousness disciplines because these disciplines provide tools also for ourselves as scientists, but also as tools to help patients suffering on different disturbances. As examples, the use of clinical hypnosis. Now we have a very big problem, which may be for some people a problem, but maybe for some people it's a source of creativity. It's a question of reality ordering. Immanuel Kant said, humans give an order to nature, but they never will know if the orders they give to nature also will be the order of nature. And this means we always construct models. We construct models of the world, we construct models of ourselves, who am I, for example, and we try to get a deeper understanding of us, of other people, and of the world. And in this context, these reality ordering systems do play a very important role. I want to make a reference now to Lawrence Leshan, who is a very prominent US American psychologist. He's still living, he's 95 meanwhile around, and he has written very good books on this topic. And he makes a distinction here. He says, if a system of reality ordering forbids certain events from occurring, you cannot explain that event within the system. It is like trying to explain parallel lines meeting within the system of Euclidean geometry. You can try all you want, but it simply cannot be done. If an apparently impossible event occurs, you have to explain it within a system in which it can occur. You can explain the parallel lines meeting within the system of Riemannian geometry. You cannot in the Euclidean system. It is not that it is difficult or complex to explain. It cannot be done. And here I want to make a reference to Charles Tart in the United States, who is also a very prominent psychologist and researcher on altered states of consciousness, who coined the term state-specific sciences. And this means if you as a scientist, you're studying a problem, a mathematical problem or a clinical psychological problem, whatever, and you will maybe have learned a self-hypnosis technique, whatever, and you enter this altered state, you have a chance to look to this problem in a total different way. You have the chance to look from a very different perspective. And then suddenly you may get an insight, oh, I never had thought it could be in that way. So this is really a source for creativity for researchers. And you can find it in the internet. Charles Tart has a very nice homepage. If you look in his homepage, you can download also his state-specific science concept. So what we do is we construct knowledge. And there are different ways: knowledge by description, knowledge by acquaintance, and knowledge by identity or fusion. Knowledge by description is very necessary, and without this dimension we couldn't become an academic specialist, because this means we read books, we use media to construct knowledge and so on, and we can, for example, read 10 or 20 books about Africa, and then we know something, or maybe more about Africa. What languages are spoken there, we know about ethnics, political systems, state buildings, failed states, whatever. But we are not familiar. We know something about it, but we are not familiar. This is the second dimension, knowledge by acquaintance. So if you want to come to Austria to learn skiing, you cannot do it by reading a book. You have to put on the skis on the mountain and to have learned by doing, and to become familiar with this situation, otherwise it's not possible. And the third kind is knowledge by identity, which is very difficult to understand. But I hope I can provide some understanding. What does it mean? In knowledge by identity, the subject knows something by virtue of being it. In the experience of fusion, a knowing of the referent comes about through becoming the referent. This means it becomes experience knowledge from within. Identification with the object permits experiential knowledge. And here also the researchers in the field of altered states of consciousness have done pioneering works. For example, Arthur Dykman in the United States made with his students meditation experiences, experiments. A very simple design. The students were instructed to give full attention to a small blue vase and to do nothing else. 100% concentration on a small blue vase. And some of them later on told Arthur Dykman about the experiences in the following way. Suddenly I was not sure, is the vase in me or I am in the vase, whatever. It was an intensive or very dramatic experience of a kind of fusion with the object. Now we could argue that this is a very nice experience to have, but it's nothing more. But I would say it's nothing more, and it's really a kind of a source to detect something new elements, and I want to give you one example. Maybe you have heard about Barbara McClintock. She was a very prominent biologist, and at high age, she got the Nobel Prize for the detection of the so-called jumping genes in the Kornpflanze. What is Kornpflanze? Maize, yeah, the jumping genes in the maize. And she was deeply convinced that she only could detect these jumping genes with respect to the way she had a relationship to her plants. She was very familiar with her plants, and she loved her plants, and every plant was an individuum for her, and she entered the plants in the sense of a fusion. And she was convinced that only this very special kind of relatedness, these deep fusion experiences, have allowed her to detect the jumping genes. So, what does it exactly mean when the subject knows something by virtue of being it? That's still a very interesting question, and I'm dealing with this now for many, many years. This is a picture I like very much. It is from Arno Böcklin, and it's called The Island of the Dead. And what I want to show here, you have two possibilities to look at this picture. You can do it in a very rational, analytical way. So you can look at this picture and to say, okay, there is this rock with this tree in front of, there is this in trance, and there is this small boat with this figure and so on. That's one possibility. The other possibility is you will look to the picture and will not comment it, and you will not say it is this and that and so on. You will be receptive and allow the experience to happen, to come in this picture, and that you get totally involved, and so maybe you will experience what Mihai Csikszentmihalyi called the flow experience, and you will become one in some sense with this picture. This is a very different approach, and there are two basic modes of perception, which may be also in altered states of consciousness, and these modes of perception also may allow to create alternate realities. According to Ernest Schachtel, we can make a differentiation between the autocentric perception on the one hand and the allocentric perception on the other. Autocentric perception means that our interpretation of the world is strongly influenced by our emotions, by our desires, by our anxieties and so on. It is a very ego-centered interpretation, a very ego-centered perception. If we try to become free, if we try to become fully concentrated to an object, to a phenomenon, whatever, we will enter to the allocentric perception, and this means to look to something, to an animal, to a plant, to a human being, in its own right. To look at something in its own right. So, I want to give a small illustration. I have not here the examples, but some painters said if I want to paint a tree, you have to become the tree. Yes, to have totally involved it, and then you have a chance to make a good picture. So the allocentric mode of perception provides an approach how to understand knowledge construction by identification or fusion. To develop the allocentric mode of perception is necessary for creativity in general and for scientific exploration, detections in special. So unfortunately, this is not taught at universities. It's not taught in clinical courses, it's not taught in mathematics, it's not taught in chemistry, never. But you can make your own experiments. You can learn to look to things in different ways, in a rational, analytic way, in a more involved way, and you can observe yourself how much your actual emotions, your states have an influence how you interpret, or can you become free from an inner perspective and be receptive, allows the experience to happen. And from my point of view, this should be cultivated in all scientific disciplines. Now, Lawrence Leshan postulated general classes of realities. And he made a distinction between the sensory modes of being, the clairvoyant modes of being, the transpsychic modes of being, and the mythic modes of being. This is a category system, of course, and there is always a big temptation that when categories will function, provide a useful model, we try to believe it's a kind of truth. You never should do this. It could also be in a total different way, but from my point of view, these general classes are very helpful to understand what it could mean to experience alternate realities, may it be in the waking state or may it be in total altered states of consciousness. And I only want to focus on the sensory modes of being and on the mythic modes of being, because the stuff is too much for this lecture. The sensory modes of being, characterized by Lawrence Lejeune. All valid information directly or indirectly comes from the senses. All events happen in space and time. All events have a cause. Events in the past can be remembered or at last theoretical, the effects observed, but cannot be changed. Events in the future can be at last theoretically changed. Objects separate in space are separate objects. Events separate in time are separate events. All activity, movement takes place through space and takes measurable time units to occur. Action, movement, or change of movement takes place only when one entity is in direct contact with another. All objects and events are composed of parts that can be at last theoretically dealt with separately. When objects or events have similar parts, they can be placed in classes for a specific purpose, and the entire class can be thought of it, dealt with as if it were one object or event. This can also be done with classes of objects or events. And this is very important, and this is always the conclusion of any kind of alternate reality we may experience. This is the only valid way to regard reality. All other ways are an illusion. And this is the important point, that from these sensory modes of being, when we look to alternate realities, we say these are illusions. They don't have any meaning. And Lawrence Lejeune wants to show, and he did it, that this is a total erroneous assumption, that the other modes of being have in a different context a very important meaning. And in comparison to these sensory modes of being, which is typically for Western scientific research, I want to show you the mythic ones, the mythic modes of being. And this is totally different now, what we have heard before. There is no difference between perception and symbol, object and image, thing and name. Each is and can be used if it is the other. Objective and subjective cannot be differentiated. There is no difference between in here and out there. Anything can become identical with anything else or stand for anything else once the two have been connected. Once this connection has been made, time and space cannot break it, but an appropriate act of will, correctly expressed, can. Each part of a thing is the equivalent of the whole. If you break up an object or event, each of the parts equals the whole. To control the part is to control the whole. To know the real names of something is to know over it. To manipulate something got lost. To manipulate the symbol of something is to manipulate the thing it stands for it. Space is determined by the connections between things and events. If they are connected and therefore identical, space between them does not exist. If they are unconnected, space cannot connect them. This is irrelevant to the sensory space or to the geometric space. Time is determined by the connections between events. If two events are the same event, time cannot separate them. If they are unconnected, time cannot connect them. This is irrelevant to clock or calendar chime. All events start with a specific act of will. To explain an event is to show the connection to this act of will, which indeed needs no explanation and is inexplicable. There is a substance that all things and people have to varying degrees that determines their effectiveness, their ability to influence events. It can be gathered and redistributed by appropriate behavior. Its names include mana, vakenda, manitu, power, baraka. It is a sort of material energy that affects things and determines the course of events. It can be used for good or evil. In itself, it is neither black nor white, but gray. There is no such thing as accidental. Everything has meaning and is charged with meaning. Since part and whole are one, to understand the smallest part is to understand the whole and vice versa. Birth and death are change from one form of existence to another. They are, as are sleep and wakefulness, two similar phases of the same being. And again, very important, within this mode of mythic being, this is the only valid way to interpret reality. So if we try to put the things together now, we have ritual processes, and in these ritual processes may be trance and symbolic embedded more or less. And we have one dimension, the trance dimension, which I use in a very general sense for the whole field of altered states of consciousness. And at the left side, we have what I call symbolic meaning. So we know rituals with no trance, but with symbolic meaning. If you go to a church, to a mass, you will see all what is going on. It is a symbolic action, what is going on, of course, but normally it has nothing to do with trance. But sometimes, if there is a good choir and the music, someone may enter in an altered state of consciousness, and you have the symbolic meaning and trance. There are, of course, trance states, altered states of consciousness, without any kind of symbolic meaning. And we have, of course, the combination of the two, and there are, of course, waking states with no trance and with no symbolic meaning. So this is a systems approach to put these things together, and I will close very soon. Some conclusions: benefits of altered states of consciousness, alternate realities, and ritual processes. This is not an exhausting list, but these are some things which will be very fruitful. We can improve our personal growth. We can develop our personal wisdom. We can get a better understanding of ourselves, of others, the world, and the universe. We can get well again when we had a disease, or we can improve our health state. And for us as scientists, we can improve our research skills. So we can improve our thinking styles. Researchers have adapted various ways of thinking, have developed basic belief systems, mindscapes, root metaphors, whatever, about how things are. For example, man as a machine or man as a living organism. Have made decisions in regard to a special epistemology, maybe an objectivist or a constructivist epistemology. Have demonstrated preference for a special philosophy of science. Some will be positivists, others may be critical rationalists, hermeneutics, and so on. And its corresponding scientific methodology. So some researchers prefer quantitative approaches, some prefer qualitative approaches. I prefer both of them. It depends on the question and so on. And methods, that's also, it belongs to our inventory. So the basis, these mental characteristics of researchers may be conceived and consolidate what I call the mental infrastructure of theory building. The mental infrastructure is characteristic for the individual and reflects his or her cognitive, motivational, affective, and personality characteristics. The basic argument is that every kind of theory building needs an infrastructure of this kind which, on the one hand, enables theory building and on the other hand, constrains theory building. We always have to include something and we have to exclude something. Thus, the mental infrastructure of the theory building represents the basis ingredients of all researchers' theorizing. And here, altered states of consciousness, alternate realities, and even rituals may be very fruitful and offer a lot of benefits. To sum up, reconstructing our philosophies of science, our epistemologies, and general worldviews via systematic self-reflection may help us to gain a better insight in the underlying generating principles and make visible the constructive character of all our ways of thinking. And we never should forget, we invent the categories. The categories don't exist outside of the mind, we invent them. This insight may allow a deeper understanding of the reasoning, the scientific reasoning of researchers, and enhance our tolerance towards them and their ways to practice science. Finally, this insight may contribute well to our personal growth and may improve our scientific development. So I have 3 minutes too much, but I thank you now for your attention.